Welcome, everybody, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya, and I'm delighted to have on the podcast with me today Laura Powell, who's become a good friend of mine over the course of the pandemic, and who is, in my view, an absolute pandemic hero. Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jay. I'm always happy to talk to you.
Well, the reason I asked you on, Laura, is because you've been involved in a fight that has lasted now years against a law that was passed in California with the unassuming title of AB 2098. That law was a law that essentially restricted the ability of doctors to tell their patients what they thought. And actually, it's a great free speech victory. And I wanted to tell folks who are listening to the podcast about that victory and your central role that you played in that victory. So I'm really glad that you agreed to come on and tell the story. But first, before we get into that, I wanted to make sure the audience knows you're a lawyer. You've been a lawyer for a while. You've been a lawyer in the state of California for a while. What were you doing before the pandemic? What was your background?
Well, I had young kids, so I was mostly focusing on them. I had been a public defender. In law school, I focused on international human rights. I ended up becoming a public defender. Around the time I got married, I switched to appeals, which I could do at home and have more flexibility. So I was doing that part-time and mostly focusing on my kids, kind of planning on ramping up my work more when they were finally in school. And that was on the horizon in 2020, when all of a sudden they were sent home with no warning. We lived in a very small house and my husband was home. We never planned on all four of us being there 24/7. And the kids had a lot of energy, no place to go to play. So that just kind of, slammed me in the face in 2020. So yeah, that's where I was, trying to step back from my work because of the pandemic, but legal cases take a long time. So I was still trying to work with no workspace at all.
So you'd been essentially doing public defender work, then some appeals work. I mean, you weren't like a rich corporate lawyer in the pocket of big Coke or something like that.
Yeah, no, I was very underpaid. I've always been a very underpaid lawyer, always had.
Well, I mean,
I've had clients who couldn't afford to pay me. And you can also tell if you've ever known any public defenders, just something I have to say off the bat, because now I get called, right wing and, accused of being a Trump supporter and all this stuff that's really bizarre to me because I've always moved in circles where everybody was radical left. I mean, and not just liberals. I mean, people I've been friends with, worked with, label themselves as communists. Like those are the circles I've lived in my whole life. And so it's a little bizarre that now all this stuff, the same principles that I'm supporting now are now labeled right wing.
Okay, so let's talk about those principles. And in particular, I want to, because we're talking about AB 2098, well, actually, first let's describe what AB 2098. What was that law?
Well, it started kind of specifically to go after doctors who were doing things like tweeting things that certain people thought were not true. So that's where it started. Around the time when it was getting its hearing, just before it's got its first hearing.
This is in the California Assembly.
It was in the California Assembly that was started with this vaccine working group of I think it was 7 senators and assembly members got together. And there was a slate of COVID bills introduced in early 2022. So that got a lot of people's attention. And this one, I don't know how they divvied up the bills that they decided, but this one went to Evan Lowe, who's an assembly member.
He actually is running for congressman in my district.
Yeah, I saw that. And I think he actually did make the runoff just by one vote or whatever. I don't know. I didn't really read it. But yeah, he got assigned this. I mean, I don't know if we want to go into the whole hearings right off the bat, but I didn't get the sense that he actually knew anything about the bill. So, it had started as the idea behind it started in the summer of 2021 with the Federation of State Medical Boards, who had this in July of 2021, made this big announcement about how they wanted to medical boards to use their authority over doctors to try to control what they said about COVID. So that was the spark that people went with. And, some of the assembly members, or probably Senator Pan seems to be Senator Richard Pan.
who was a very was a senator
Yeah.
in California, in the California Senate, and a longtime vaccine advocate. I think he was responsible for some of the vaccine mandates that went through the California legislature even before the pandemic.
Yeah, before the pandemic, the thing he got a lot of attention for was a bill that removed all these exemptions from the school vaccine mandates. So that, drew a lot of ire from the anti-vax groups. I hadn't paid a lot of attention to him because I wasn't involved in those groups, and it wasn't really on my radar.
I'd never heard of him before. I wasn't involved with any of those groups either. Yeah. I mean, so it was anyways, in 2021, this coalition comes together, and their main concern is that there are doctors who are saying things about COVID that they don't like. Doctors, some of them were saying things like, you should take ivermectin. Other doctors who are saying things like, the marginal benefit of the vaccine for children is probably very low, and we don't know what the side effects are for COVID, the COVID vaccines, that is. Others are saying lockdowns are a really bad idea and are hurting kids. We should open our schools. So they're coming together, concerned that doctors are saying things that they and some other people who have power in public health don't like.
Yeah, masks don't work is on the list of things that they didn't want people saying. So, you can't go around just making it illegal to say these things, but someone thought maybe we could go after the doctor's licenses. Maybe they aren't allowed to say it because when people see they're a doctor, that their opinions carry more weight. So we really want to stop them. But the thing is, doctors still have free speech. So they ran into a problem there.
Okay, well, we're going to get to free speech. So but I want to just stay on the impetus behind the law, and then maybe get into some of the groups that were behind the law. So you mentioned this Federation of Medical Boards.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important, right? So doctors, many doctors are board certified. Board certified means you've completed your residency, you have a license to practice because you've completed, and but you don't, like, board certification is an extra kind of like gold star that the doctors can get, that say, look, I have mastered my subject even beyond what you would expect for in residency. It allows you to get, jobs that you might not otherwise be able to get. And they set the agenda for what the field, the field believes. So here are guidelines put out by some medical board, and so when this Federation of Medical Boards, they're an umbrella group, if I understand, that oversees state medical boards all across the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a separate issue what you're talking about. Those extra certifications are from private entities, but these are just the basic licenses that come from the state, and that's why these constitutional rights become important, because the medical boards for each state. So the Federation of State Medical Boards is like a group where they all get together at a conference and discuss things that are going on and what the best practices are and all that. So they sent out a thing saying, all 50 states, we recommend that you use your authority over these doctors to prevent them from speaking about COVID in a way that we think is wrong.
So the point is that, like, now this group, this is a quasi-governmental group that has the kind of power to really compel doctors to do what they want them to do. Because if they don't listen, the doctors can face all kinds of problems in their professional life.
Yeah, I mean, the medical boards themselves are an actual government group, not a quasi-government group. So this is just the organization. Yeah, it's a call to action for these actual government agencies. Okay. And so. Right.
And it's not a small number of people. These are not like a vast number of medical experts coming. This is a relatively small number of politically well-connected people.
Well, they aren't really medical experts at all that are necessarily involved in these. These are political entities. The president of the state medical board in California at the time is a lawyer, and she is one of the actors that really pushed for this law. Mostly behind the scenes. It wasn't pushed for by the actual medical board, even though it was empowering them. They did not ask for this law. They actually every year get together and make a list of laws they would like to see and send it to the legislature. This was not even discussed. And they didn't actually support this until the very last minute. All through the debate, they were not signed on to supporting this bill. The president of the medical board, she's not a doctor at all, and she supported this. She won an award from the Federation of State Medical Boards in the spring of 2022 for her work on this issue.
Okay, and the content of the bill, what exactly was in the bill? Actually, I should say bill. It actually became a law.
Yeah.
So what when it was first proposed, what was in it? How did it evolve in the legislative process?
It was pretty broad at the beginning because it was aimed at, and they talk about that it was aimed at these people who were, they talk so much about Simone Gold. And the whole legislative analysis was about her pretty much, and how she was involved in January 6th and all this stuff that really seemed irrelevant to me.
She's a doctor, was a doctor anyway. So
I think she is, and they've taken no action against her, I believe.
And she was also a lawyer. Very early on, she was formed a coalition of doctors who thought that advocated for early treatment. Actually, I've talked with her quite a bit. There's some stuff I agree with her or disagree with her, but her motivation was to try to figure out how to help patients, deal with this threat.
Yeah.
But of course, she was not very popular.
Yeah. But I think using her as example, I don't think she was treating patients. They were upset because she was a public figure speaking out publicly and saying things that, were perhaps not correct about what treatments work. I don't know.
Well, early on, it's there's a lot of uncertainty. Of course, doctors should be able to speak with each other about what they see works and doesn't work. You can do scientific evaluations come from the hypotheses generated by that kind of discussion.
Yeah, you have to be wrong. You have to give people. This is, I'm not a scientist, but this isn't any kind of
which is not to say she was wrong about everything. She was right about some things, right? So it's one of these things where you have to allow people to have a space to discuss, especially doctors.
Yeah. Well, and certainly the people behind this bill were wrong, demonstrably wrong about many things.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it started off really aimed at those people like her who were saying things publicly. And then it was just before the first hearing. I had written a letter, explaining why it was unconstitutional. And actually the people with the committee, the chair of the committee and the main staffer of the committee are both lawyers. So they had enough background to recognize that this was blatantly unconstitutional. So they tried to put in a fix. So this was just a few days before our first hearing was when there was a major change to it. But the problem was then they were trying to fit this into a different hole and trying to make it work, trying to make it constitutional. But it set out to do something that was unconstitutional. And you couldn't just fix it by tweaking the words here and there.
So they set out to try to restrict the public utterances of doctors on Twitter, on TV, or wherever. The bill goes to the Assembly committee or whatever, and they realize, gosh, we really shouldn't be doing this. We we don't have the power to restrict it. Doctors have First Amendment rights. So what did they do to the bill?
So they tried to, part of the problem is it just became so convoluted. It was really bizarre. The language started to get increasingly confusing. And then because they were trying to fit in the definition of misinformation, they were trying to say it had to be between a doctor and a patient. Because there's some case law in the Ninth Circuit, the federal circuit for the West Coast, that says something about kind of limiting rights, free speech rights in the doctor-patient context. It says something kind of like that. That's what they were relying on. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that's not quite right. There's this professional speech doctrine. What the law says, what the constitutional law says is that you can take action, but as long as it only incidentally restricts the speech of doctors, if it's otherwise
Well,
an
so like
appropriate
if,
thing. Like, and this comes up in the context of therapy. That's where these cases are, because the treatment is the talking. So where do you draw the line between the treatment and the speech? So that's what some previous cases have grappled with. So they tried to squeeze it in there. But it just didn't work. I mean, the reality is anything that the doctors that constitutes misconduct, negligence, that would already be actionable if it was something that was potentially harmful to the patient. But the whole point was focused on the content of the speech. And this is just clear First Amendment law. If you're going after the content of the speech,
can I
it's
probe that
strict scrutiny.
distinction for just a second? So if I'm a doctor that's managing some patient and I tell them something that's just blatantly bad for the patient, right? So I do something that causes harm to the patient. There are legal actions the patient can take against me, the doctor. It's not free speech for me to harm a patient by telling them to do something that ends up harming them. Like, there are malpractice laws, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So even criminal laws can be applied in some of those, in very, very rare instances. But the point is that that's not the kind of speech that they were restricting.
Yeah. I mean, it was specifically aimed at the content of the speech. And so one of the things also that's really driven me crazy, I'm still continuing to see this on how it gets spoken about by the politicians and sometimes in the media, is that I don't know if they're just lying about what the bill says, but they will say, oh, if a patient is harmed, or if, and they took out some language that said something about like they should take into account if a patient was harmed. It was originally in there. But they say, oh, if it's done intentionally, if they intentionally lie to their patients and harm them, then yeah, they should be able to take action. Well, of course,
why do they
can
need
already
such a
take
law?
action.
Yeah, but why do they need such a law? We already have medical malpractice law.
Yeah. Or you're talking maybe more about fraud in this case. And, as you mentioned with Simone Gold, who not really even acquainted with her work, but I'm pretty sure most of these people that believe in what they're saying. They believe when they're recommending treatments that they're doing it because they actually do believe they're helpful. I don't know that there's any real world example of a licensed physician who is saying things knowing it will, harm their patients, and they're saying them anyway because they're trying to make money from this treatment. That's what they're pretending like this law was going after. And you obviously could go after doctors who do that. That's not what this law was going after. And you see, although they wouldn't talk about it, it was very frustrating during the process in the legislature, during the hearings. Nobody would answer any of these questions of what it is. Like, maybe you could explain to me with this example constitute, misconduct under AB 2098. Because we would have people, some of the plaintiffs in our lawsuit we eventually get to, like Tracy Hogue, she would go on Twitter and people would say, when AB 2098 passes, your license is going to be in trouble, for saying things, interpreting studies, really doing her job in a correct way. And the people who supported the law seemed to think that that would run afoul of the law. I mean, she clearly had a constitutional right, a free speech right, and also just, it's part of being a scientist, right, to have these discussions. So what they thought the law would do was clearly unconstitutional, but in the assembly, they wouldn't, and when it went to the Senate, they wouldn't really talk about details.
You mentioned something I wanted to explore just for a second before we get on to your this amazing speech. That's where I really started learning about you, that you gave in, I think it was in the assembly in the public comments on the law, and you said you wrote a letter saying, look, this is likely unconstitutional. What motivated you to do that?
No one else was doing it. It was sort of, I've thought about this over the course of this case. So often it was like, who's going to do this? And I'm asking people I know who might be interested, other lawyers, who's going to do this? And I kept looking around and nobody was doing it. And, some of my friends would say, Laura, you're the one who's going to do this, So, I mean, part of it, I started Californians for Good Governance before this, but it was fall of 2021 because I thought, what happened to, the ACLU, although they eventually did support us on this case, but all these groups who cared about civil liberties before, and they were mostly liberals, and now all those people, those same people were so scared of COVID that they had just abandoned all those principles. And I kind of thought there's got to be some people like me who still, identify as liberal, but still believe in civil liberties, so I was thinking I want to try to speak to them. So that's where, I was seeing nobody else was doing this. I mean, there was one other letter from a legal organization, a conservative legal organization, opposing this. And, they had a legal analysis. No other lawyers were speaking up. There were a few here and there, but formally in the opposition. So I wrote the letter explaining it, and the committee offered me the witness spot. You get, just a few minutes for each side as the primary witnesses. And these meetings, the public doesn't even get to speak, more than just standing up and saying they oppose or support. So I went there with Tracy Hogue. So I thought it was kind of a nice balance that she could.
So this is in early 2022,
This was April 2022, the first hearing in the Assembly. I ended up testifying again at the hearing in the Senate, and that time with Aaron Cariotti, who's also one of our plaintiffs.
So, the folks that are listening to this podcast, I very highly recommend going and listening to Laura speak in front of the California legislature. I thought there were several other witnesses, none of whom spoke against the law. I think you were the only one really that was other than you and Tracy at that hearing. It's just maybe I'm biased, but you all had the most cogent arguments, and it was really clear that the Assembly members that were considering it, or the California legislature members, hadn't really thought about the law, like the basic idea of what the law was supposed to be, how it's supposed to be written, what impact it would have on the speech of doctors, and what impacts it would have on patients. They hadn't considered even it in the slightest, and you brought that out in your testimony very clearly, I thought.
Yeah, thanks. But yeah, they don't really think about. That's really disappointing, and to see what goes on in Sacramento when I was spending a lot of time there in 2022, and really feeling like nobody was really, they just vote along party lines. There isn't a lot of attention paid, and it's shows too, it's not even, some of it's just the sloppiness too. And why in the end, the bill that they passed wasn't even grammatically comprehensible because nobody was.
Well, a federal judge has said that. Is the one that said that. So you give this testimony, and let's just say from a personal thing, you reached out to me a couple of times before you gave that testimony, and I have to say I didn't really. I wasn't really paying much attention to this bill because I thought it would just look so farcical that there's no way that anyone serious would actually pass the thing, much less advocate for the thing, much less pass it. And that any serious evaluation of it would lead people to understand that it was going to be a violation of free speech rights of doctors that would harm patients. When you reached out to me, I was of course against the bill, but I was so busy with. 2021 was a blur. Let's just put it that way.
This is 2022.
Even 2022 was a blur. That I thought, okay, and you looked like you had it under control. So I thought, okay, and then I saw your testimony. In fact, I watched the whole of the testimony, and I was just blown away by your arguments, and I was blown away. But I was also so shocked by the shallowness of the other side that were advocating for the bill, and the shallowness of the legislative members that were considering it. That's when I first realized we really do have some problem here. So, it was, I don't know if, you obviously saw before I did that this was going to be a major problem.
Yeah. It's all, the reality is the stuff there wasn't really any discussion at that hearing. There was one proponent, she's part of the working group, and a doctor who said some stuff that was all untrue. There were a couple witnesses on the other side. There wasn't really any discussion. And the reality is, people aren't making up, the legislators aren't making up their mind in the hearing. They're going to vote with their party. That's how it always works in California, pretty much. And the Democrats have a majority, so they don't really bother to think too hard about these things. In the Senate hearing, there was more discussion. That was in June. There was some discussion, but it was just so bizarre because it really felt like nobody had really read the bill, and they were, even the proponents were like, well, this bill only said, only would apply in cases where it's intentional, they're intentionally harming people. And, it wasn't what the bill said. They had no idea, what it was they were passing. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the medical board, the federal the Association of Medical Boards that pushed the bill, but there were some other groups that were involved as well, including the California Medical Association, and then there's this sort of fly-by-night group called the No License for Disinformation that spent a fair bit of time. It felt like they've spent most of their time on Twitter trolling you and me and some others who were advocating against the bill online.
Yeah. So yeah, the sponsor was the California Medical Association, and I can't say I know a lot about them, except that they are very close to Gavin Newsom. We're sitting next to him at the infamous French Laundry dinner.
So let's just stay on that for just a second. So you have essentially a medical lobby organization who supposedly represents some California doctors, and they are very politically close to Governor Newsom, to the extent where they are having secret dinners with him during lockdown in the French Laundry, one of the most famous restaurants, most expensive restaurants in California. And Newsom is having dinner with the CMA members. This is in 2020, I think it was, during Newsom's lockdowns. And they are a major sponsor of a bill to silence doctors.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I can't tell you more than that.
But it's hard to make this stuff up, right? So that's kind of that. All right, but of course they strike me as like a really serious problem, because they're so politically well connected, and they are so evidently not representing the doctors they're supposed to represent. California Medical Association, right?
Yeah.
What about this no license for disinformation group? Like, because you wrote a fantastic article describing not just about them, but just the whole zoo of groups, this sort of like this panoply of groups that were like pushing the law, and you published it in a site called the Brownstone site.
Yeah, so I had tried to ignore them, because they were just like a few doctors who got together and formed a little nonprofit, and it was after the Federation of State Medical Boards had this call to action, and they said, yes, let's do this. Let's go after doctors who say things about COVID that we think are wrong. So yeah, they were just a little group of people that, and sent their director was one of the primary witnesses of both the hearings that I testified at. And so I kind of tried to ignore them, because but then I went and looked at, because none of the other proponents, the legislatures that were behind it, would speak publicly about details about what they thought the law would do. But these people they would go on Twitter and say, we're going to take away licenses for people for saying things like this on Twitter. And so this is clearly what they thought that the law would do. And they were really people who were pushing for it. And they were there, invited by the bill's author to be witnesses in favor twice. So I went and started reading all their tweets, and it was just, this was another case where I thought, maybe I can pass this along to a journalist and get them to write it up. And people said, the journalist I talked to said, you write it. So I wrote it. In a way, I kind of hated doing that, because it was just, reading all these tweets from these people that were just so misinformed, and they would provide legal analyses, and they're just some doctors or people who weren't even doctors who,
many of them, the people that were most active attacking me and you and others on were they had very little experience. Like, they were, they just completed residency, or they had just started residency. Some weren't even were still in medical school, and like, it's fine. Like they have their view. They're very earnest in their view that we needed lockdowns, we needed school closures, we needed masks, we needed whatever. And they're entitled to their view. But what they wanted was to destroy the careers of doctors that disagreed with them. You look at the title of their organization: No License for Disinformation. It means you can't have a medical license if you post things a study that says child masking doesn't work, you lose your license. That's what they wanted for doctors in this state.
Yeah. And early on, that's what their website was all about. They said, here's a link to where to report this person. They would have like profiles on different doctors who had said things publicly that they didn't like. And they would write up, this person said masks don't work. This person said schools should reopen. And then they would say, here's a link, go report them to the medical board. And they had just zero understanding of the sort of broader picture of free speech and, the legal rights, and just none whatsoever. So I mostly tried to ignore them. But after I'd done all this, I thought it was kind of important to write up, because everybody just kept their mouths shut about what they were really trying to do. And they would play dumb, right? The politicians would play dumb and be like, no, we're just doing this. But if you go and look at what these people are saying they're going to do, it was clearly going after doctors for saying things on Twitter that they disagreed with. And it was nothing more than that. They somehow think that they had got the answers. They have everything figured out, and that anybody who's saying something wrong should be silenced. So I don't know how much you want to get into the whole importance of free speech in this context.
Oh, no, we're going to talk about this. So we're going to get that, but I have one other thing before we get to that, and I have to. This is just a point of personal privilege on this. That I also tried to just ignore them, because they just seemed like they just were ignorant, and they weren't really contributing to the conversation. But then they started like saying absolute lies about me. So for instance, they were convinced that I'm somehow funded by the Koch brothers. I've never taken the Koch brothers for any of my. I'm an NIH funded researcher, right? And they kept posting these conspiracy theory like things where like there's this dark web of like circles, and I'm connected
the chart.
to 50...
It's like the guy with the meme with the guy. They're like that, and they made them. I'm so sad that I didn't get on one of those, because they made those before I was.
I'm a central node in all of their things.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to say on the line, this is a lie. Like, why are you? And I to one of the people that was doing this, I said, look, you're posting lies. You're literally lying about my funding, about my motivations, my connections. Please stop doing it. And of course they didn't. They doubled down. I mean, so it was really kind of annoying to me. It didn't seem like they were worth much of my attention, but I just didn't like having those lies told about me by this group.
Yeah, I mean, they said things like about me. They just go out and make something up, and then it's really bizarre. There's
Laura, just for the record, are you funded by dark money?
I don't think so. I mean, there was a bag of money on my. No, I mean, I don't. I have been doing this pro bono, which I'm almost embarrassed to say, that I should have been monetizing this, and I should have been getting some money from somebody, but I've been doing all this work pro bono, and I don't really have time to go out and seek funding. I've
taken $0 for my COVID related work.
Yeah.
I mean, early in the pandemic, I thought it would be unethical for me to profit off of my COVID related work. So I've turned down honoraria. I've lost money from my COVID related work. Yeah. I mean, even this Substack, it's it's supporting my colleague's career, not mine. So because I'm not taking any money from my COVID related work. And so it was to have this group tell this lie, and it seemed like it had some traction. Really, it was really kind of ridiculous.
I kind of hate the whole question. I mean, I know people on like my side kind of do this too, and I try to, I don't have any basis for knowing where other people might get funding from, but I kind of hate the idea that you have to work pro bono. I'm not independently wealthy, and if I get some funding, I've got to trace back. I mean, everybody, so it's kind of becomes this very elitist thing, because if you get paid by anybody, suddenly you're tainted by, you have to.
That's a good point. It's a really good point. There's nothing wrong with getting paid to like hard work, especially work that puts you in the eye of the storm. I don't have any problem with people that did that. And of course, it's an ad hominem attack to say that you only believe what you're doing because you're getting paid. It's not actually a logical argument. So I'm not having any. I don't have any. I mean, I'm not trying to argue that everyone should do this pro bono. But the fact is that both of us were working on this pro bono.
Yeah.
Like, and so like, and then yet nevertheless we get attacked as if we were doing this because we're getting paid to do this. It's just really frustrating. And especially when you say Coke money, essentially what you're doing is you're trying to poison the well. You're trying to say, look, these people are politically motivated. That's the only reason they would do such a thing. That's the power of the word Coke money in especially in left wing circles. And so it was essentially like a kind of slander, especially an untrue slander, because neither of us were getting paid for the work that we were doing on this. Okay, so and the other, actually, there's another funny thing. Again, a point of personal privilege. I am a researcher, right? I have an MD, yes, but I'm primarily a researcher. I don't see patients. I don't have a license to see patients. I made a decision very early in my career that I loved research so much that I wanted to spend 100% of my time on it. And so the no license for disinformation folks, when they discovered this, they got quite upset that their pet law wouldn't directly impact me because I'm a researcher and I can. They can't take my license away because I don't have a license to threaten. And actually, it points to some policy issues around this. Like, so what they were trying to do is they're trying to use the license as a weapon against the people that had the license.
Hi, everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting new sponsor, Alchemy Elements. We've been shopping around trying to find the best sponsors that align with our mission and our values and what we stand for. And we've come across Alchemy Elements, which I'm very excited to bring to you guys, which is a synergistic herbal supplement. It's a mix of several adaptogenic plant compounds. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens, you might have heard on Andrew Huberman's podcast, are plant medicines that help the body adapt to stress, essentially. And so there's a number of adaptogens in here, including cordyceps mushrooms, reishi mushrooms, astragalus, shilajit, polygala, lion's mane mushrooms, and other compounds as well. And you just take a tablespoon of this, you put it in your morning coffee or your smoothie or a protein shake, and you're good to go. I've been doing this for about a week, and as it suggests, some of the short-term effects of increased focus, increased concentration, more energy. I've already been feeling some of that. Look forward to taking it more in the long term and reporting back as we do more of these ads. We've been very careful and selective in what to sponsor on our program, and this is something that I can totally get behind. And as long as you keep hearing ads about this particular product, Alchemy Elements, you can be assured that this is something that I stand behind and can personally vouch for and recommend individuals try. So for a limited time right now, people who are watching or listening to this podcast, they can get a 10% discount on their first order, or they can get a 30% discount for all subscription orders if you subscribe for a certain amount of deliveries per month. And if you order a subscription package, then you can get the premium gold kit as well, which includes this really nice gold bottle and a gold spoon to store your alchemy elements. Just use the code word illusion. If you're on Spotify or Apple or Substack, we'll drop a link below, or you can manually type in alchemyelements.com and you can add your products to the cart, and you can put in the code illusion, and you can get the 10% off discount for the first order or 30% off for the subscription order, and you can get your gold kit. Thank you so much to Alchemy Elements. Please check them out, and I hope you enjoy their products. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it goes to, right, who do people trust? And I said this before, that really the problem is not misinformation, it's institutional credibility. There's a lack of trust in the medical establishment as a whole, and the CDC, all these agencies that people used to have some trust in, and that has been destroyed. But people who have a doctor, an individual doctor they have a relationship with, they're going to tend to trust them. So I think there's a sense like that. Those are individual actors they need to control. I mean, for the most part, most doctors aren't speaking freely, unfortunately, but those ones that are, they wanted to rein them in because they have a certain amount of power. So I think that's a big impetus behind the law, why they would aim at those doctors, besides the fact that they couldn't plausibly just go after anybody. I mean, publicly, you know, obviously they've been doing it behind the scenes in various ways, restricting speech, but they can't publicly censor as a government agency just anybody. But yeah, it was this way, oh, look, maybe we have power over them. And I think this wasn't actually a brand new idea. I discovered there was there's a law professor who I spoke to who is a health law, you know, he's into health law. He wants laws like this, you know, he's not a constitutional scholar or anything. So he's had written about this idea that maybe it could be done. You know, maybe there's a way that you can kind of, and, you know, it was before COVID, so it wasn't just about COVID, but maybe there's a way to get to that. But, you know, he saw this law. He said, no, this doesn't look constitutional. This went too far. This isn't the right way to do it.
And so like, okay, so there's the free speech issue. What you're doing then is you're restricting the speech of a few doctors, using their license against them so that they can't speak publicly. And now, what is the policy issue around that? To me, is if the medical boards have done something wrong, or if the government has done something wrong, some doctors, if it's a medical issue, have some almost automatic authority, especially if it's in their expertise domain, and they should be listened to, shouldn't they? I mean, it's not wrong if they're dissenting for the public to hear them dissenting. Like, part of what the public ought to be able to know. Well, look, this entity, this government entity, this powerful group of doctors have said one thing, but there are these other doctors who are pointing out substantive things that are wrong with what this powerful group of doctors said. Isn't that part of what free speech is supposed to be about?
Yeah, I think sometimes it gets lost in the debate about whether we should censor false information, is that we don't know what the false information is. And there's sort of this assumption that somehow we've already determined these things. And obviously, I mean, we've made this point many times with COVID. This is new. So we obviously don't already know everything. But even issues that have been around for forever, we don't know everything already. And, you know, right, there's classic examples of history where people were very wrong for a very long time. And, you know, if it's right, I've heard people say, if you can't question it, it's not science, it's religion. So, you know, we don't have it set out from the, you know, arbiters of truth and the government or whoever these people want to be. They don't know what's true and what's false. We don't know that. So, of course, we have to be able to say things that are not maybe correct. It's part of the process of learning stuff. One thing I wanted to go back to, though, about the free speech before we moved on, is it's not just about silencing the doctors. And this is why this is really important in First Amendment law, is it's more about the chilling effect. And I think that was really what their plan was with this law, that they may not ever use it even. They just wanted it out there as a threat hanging over doctors' heads. And who wants to, after going to medical school, everything it takes to become a doctor, and suddenly your career is gone? All of that is gone because they can take away your license. So who's going to even take that risk of speaking, you know, outside the lines at all? And then one of the huge problems is they don't define this, you know, and that was the thing. Nobody would say that, you know, what the language that finally ended up in the law is contradicted information, contradicted by the scientific consensus, contemporary scientific consensus, contrary to the standard of care, which is grammatically incoherent, but it's also so vague. So nobody is going to know when they've stepped outside those lines. The only way you're going to find out is potentially by losing your license and your livelihood. So who's going to take the risk? And I think that was what, you know, these kinds of laws that violate free speech are aimed to do, to scare everybody into compliance. And I think, you know, you can guess what it is you're supposed to say, but nobody's going to come out and say, whatever the CDC says is fact, and you can't contradict it, because that would get people's attention as being like, whoa, that's maybe too far. So they
But
never
of course,
say
that
that.
was the subtext. That was the subtext. Absolutely the
Yeah.
subtext. That, like, if you contradict what public health says, then we can go after you.
But who's speaking for public health? Too. I mean, that's, things I would discover when I listened to like the FDA meeting, authorizing the vaccine emergency use for ages 5 to 11. I sat there and listened to them, and they said all kinds of things just openly as if they were known facts that I had been told was, misinformation, that children weren't at high risk for COVID and all these things that if you say those in other contexts, you're told, no, that's misinformation. You're not allowed to say that. So, there isn't even one speaker, it keeps everybody guessing, everybody scared of stepping out of line. And we'll get to the lawsuit later, but it was like, nobody was, I in the assembly and the Senate hearings, you don't have the opportunity to, ask these questions. And, finally in court, we have the judge saying, but which consensus, like, was it the time they told us not to wear masks or the time they told us to wear masks? Which one was the correct thing that everybody would have to follow? And, he's asking the lawyer for the state that, and she's like,
Right. Okay. So I agree that there's the free speech rights of the doctors, the chilling effect, but there's one other aspect, one other policy aspect of the law I think is really, really important, and it's important to understand why the law was such an abomination. There's not always, but sometimes the case that public health will make some recommendation that actually harms some people. Right. So a good example of this would be a vaccine. Even with some rare side effects, we know that some people are going to have those rare side effects, and that can be devastating for the people that have them. And you may be able to say, like, predict in advance, okay, you have this immune condition, therefore you're more likely to have this. Right. As a doctor, you read the evidence. Maybe you can say that. Just hypothetically. What that means then that sometimes doctors will be put in a position where there's a conflict between what public health wants their patients to do and what they themselves think is good for their patients to do.
Yep.
So what should a patient expect from their doctor that they see? Should the doctor represent the interest of public health, or should they represent the patient's interest in the advice that they give to the patient?
Yeah, my understanding of medical ethics is the obligation, the ethical obligation is to the individual patient. And I mean, I know as a lawyer that's the case. I noticed this happening in the briefs in our lawsuits. Sometimes the state was saying, well, doctors have an ethical obligation to protect public health. And wait a minute, because that is very, very different, right? And then what does that do to the trust with the patient, right? I mean, this is what you're pointing out. If somebody says you should get this vaccine and you say, but are you saying that because it's going to benefit me or because you think it's right for everybody? And I mean, there was actually something really, I don't know if you were there, but there was Aaron Cariotti was talking about this, and it was so interesting. I got to see if this is in his book, but he was really going into how that played out in Nazi Germany, that very thing, which I wasn't familiar with that whole history.
In his book, yeah, he talks about it in his book extensively.
It's very, I mean, yeah, it undermines that trust, but it's a very different thing. And they just kind of seem to slip from an ethical obligation to a patient to an ethical obligation to public health. And those are different things.
Yeah. And I think you should, as a patient, you should expect that the doctor represents you, that they're thinking about you primarily. It's not that they shouldn't be thinking about public health, but when there's a conflict, they should be telling you, here's what I think will benefit you as a patient, and not force you to sacrifice for the good of all. That's not how doctors and medicine works. I think especially in the context of vaccines, especially the COVID vaccine, where there was a legitimate argument that for children especially, there wasn't a particularly large benefit, and there was the possibility of harm. Especially early on, before the evidence that started coming in about the harms of myocarditis, there's just a possibility of risk. So the question is, like, what would you as a parent expect your pediatrician to tell you about the vaccine? to tell you that that the vaccine is good for for your kid, even though the evidence doesn't say so, because they thought that it was good for public health. A lot of the motivation around making everyone get the vaccine was the false idea that the vaccine would stop you from getting and spreading COVID.
Mhm.
That, I think, was a primary motivation for trying to get kids to get the vaccine. Like, if you vaccinate the kids, then they're not going to spread the disease to their teachers. Was the idea. That wasn't true, it turns out. But let's say what had turned out to be true. Then what you have is a conflict. The kids themselves don't benefit very substantially from the COVID vaccine, and the only reason to give it is for the public health benefit. But some of the kids are going to get harmed. Myocarditis for young men, for instance. So I would expect that doctors should represent their patients in this, not public health.
Yeah, and I think if there was high levels of trust, you might see, I mean, I don't know, I haven't studied all the historical vaccine introductions. I've read little bits, but I mean, I think that if you had high levels of trust in what was going on, there would be people saying, well, maybe I'd be willing to take these risks, for the good. I mean, but now the trust has been so destroyed by real, actual lies, right? I mean, they've admitted, Fauci has admitted he's lied. And I think, realizing that's how public health operates often, is lying in order to induce behavior, this very paternalistic kind of attitude that they take. And as people become more and more aware that that's how they operate, there's less and less trust. And so, we're not going to entrust our health to people who have been lying to us. And this is why misinformation is a problem. They talk about it, and I know you've said this too, right? There's so much elitism on how these people talk about misinformation. Like, oh, these poor rubes, if they hear something, they just automatically believe it. And that isn't the problem. It's why are some ideas sticking and others are not? And they are not the ones, they want the ones from the government and the institutions to stick, and they're not sticking because people don't trust them. And the idea that everybody's just so stupid except for them, they're the elite who can be exposed to these ideas and discern truth and lies, and the masses are just whatever they hear, they believe it. I mean, it's so clearly false, because who hasn't been exposed to messaging, get your booster, blah blah blah, it's on billboards, it's everywhere you go. Everybody's been exposed to that message. So if that one's not sticking, it's not just exposure that's the problem. Obviously, that isn't what's going on.
I mean, I think you raised such an important point there, Laura. I think the key thing there then is, if you want to address the problems of misinformation as you see it, and your public, your government, or your some sort of like medical board or whatever, tell the truth. If you're public health, just tell the truth. Right? People then build trust, will start to trust you. And so when there's actual misinformation around, they'll look at you and you say it's misinformation, they'll believe you. Mm-hmm. The fundamental problem then is not we don't have enough laws to like sort of mechanically suppress the speech of people who disagree. The fundamental problem is that they've squandered all the trust that the public might have in them, because they thought that they could lie with impunity to the public, and people wouldn't see through it. That's the fundamental problem here, right?
And the censorship itself creates, an effect where people are thinking that you're up to something if you're trying to censor somebody. So that, just on its own, calling for censorship makes you seem less trustworthy to a lot of people.
Okay, so now we get to the big victory that you had. So so there's this case, this Hogue versus Newsom case. So Tracy Beth Hogue, she's been on the podcast. She's a physician in California, and there are others who signed on to this case. I think Aaron Cariotti was also been on the podcast. A doctor named Ron Darcetti, a few others.
Azadeh Khatibi and Pete Mazalewski.
So they're all heroes to me. Azadeh's been on this podcast as well. Yeah. So and you represent them in a lawsuit that goes in front of a judge, a federal judge in California. So what happened? What were the issues in that lawsuit? What did Governor Newsom's lawyers argue on the other side of it, and what was the result?
So that lawsuit, I got to give credit to the New Civil Liberties Alliance, who brought the lawsuit. They were looking for local counsel. And it was funny. They came to me and said, do you know anybody? Because normally local counsel, you have to be admitted to that court. And I wasn't admitted to that court. It's just you just have to send in your application. It's not a big deal. But I was like, no, well, I guess I could do it. It was, again, looking for somebody to do it. And a lot of times local counsel doesn't have a hands-on role in this. They're just kind of filing papers. But since I was so familiar, we kind of took a different had a different relationship there, because I already, had been living this law for the past however many months it had been around. So yeah, we filed that lawsuit with those 5 plaintiffs. There had been 3 other lawsuits filed against it. 2 of them ended up with one judge, and the other 2 we ended up with the same judge. So when we got the assignment of the judge, I got an email. It was actually kind of late. I was about to go to bed. Shouldn't have been looking at my phone. I see the email. Here's your judge. So I'm like starting to, look him up. And I had a really good feeling about it. I mean, he was older. He had a track record on some First Amendment cases. And he just seemed like he'd been around long enough that he was somebody, he was going to rule, think independently and everything. And I really got a good feeling when I looked into his background, which I still had a good feeling about him. I think he was just a good judge. He really, in a lot of ways, he ran his courtroom well and everything. But so we got our hearing in January of 2023 on our motion for a preliminary injunction, and the basic 2 parts, the First Amendment issues we talked about, the chilling effect. There's really high standards when there's a law that goes after the content of speech. When the government says you can't say certain things, so that automatically triggers strict scrutiny, which is really high bar to meet. Then, even so they can say, well, we have a compelling interest in controlling what doctors say because there's a pandemic. We can't really, argue with that. That'll be a losing argument, but, they can't meet that. Then it has to be narrowly tailored, but really the law was too vague. So that's kind of the second component, which is a due process argument. The law was so vague that no one would know what it meant, which kind of, ties in again, because doctors won't know if they're violating the law. So they're going to tend to keep their mouth shut about the topic altogether. So it was really nice for once, after having argued about this, to actually hear a judge asking the questions I had been asking, like, what does this even mean? This is grammatically incoherent. This is nonsense. I mean, the way it was written, the final language that got in there was, again, it was information contradicted by the contemporary scientific consensus contrary to the standard of care. And he's like, what's the consensus? Who decides it? It's shifting all the time. What percentage of people have to agree? Is it just doctors or is it also scientists? And, I think in some ways also we had the benefit of it being 2023 at that point, and you could get judges to see through some of the stuff that in 2020, when people brought lawsuits, the judges were like, we don't know. They say, everybody's going to die and you got to do this and that. And we're not going to second guess that. But by 2023, we had been through enough to see that they had been wrong a lot. And, they had to backtrack, they being the official, whatever, speakers for public health. So we had a judge who was asking a lot of critical questions, and they didn't have answers for. We finally got to get down where we're really arguing this instead of just tweeting about it or whatever, and having a really thoughtful judge asking all these questions. And, I kind of felt bad for the other side, and you don't always know how hearings are going, but I was left that feeling very, very good. I remember passing a note to one of our plaintiffs going, because I looked at her, Azadeh was sitting behind me and she looked a little overwhelmed. I wasn't sure if she was realizing that things were going pretty well. Just in terms of the nature of the questions he was asking, it was clear he was thinking through the critical issues. And if you think it through, you're going to realize that our side is right. But I sent her a little note going, I think this is going well. So he didn't make us wait long and granted the preliminary injunction.
And that's a big deal, right? So to win a preliminary injunction means that you're likely to win the case. That's why, and if you don't get the injunction, that the rights of the people that you're representing are going to continue to be harmed. And so while the case is being decided, so it's and the evidence standard is very, very high for that.
Yeah, for him to say, I mean, obviously this isn't a case where you're going to have a lot of evidence and testimony and everything. I mean, there would be some, doctors talking about how this might affect them. They had declarations about that, but yeah, he's saying you're probably going to win. So, I mean, they really had no chance at that. At the same time, the two cases that had a different judge who was not as thoughtful in his decision making, who denied their preliminary injunction, they were on appeal. And that was at oral argument last July. They had oral argument in the Ninth Circuit, which is maybe not going to be the friendliest circuit, although they have I don't know. I don't follow all the, federal court like decision making and everything that much. But, I watched these oral arguments and it was going so bad for the government. I mean, so bad, just the underlying assumption in every question, like, how can you tell us that, you need to follow this? We know, I mean, I don't know. I shouldn't quote them because I don't remember all the questions they were asking, but it went so bad for the government that I was like, okay, we're winning this. This is, So then what happened? So that was in July. August is the end of the
2023.
Yeah, last July.
So you have the preliminary injunction from your judge. Yeah. The oral arguments in the Ninth Circuit go poorly. Actually, the fact that Governor Newsom signed the law in late 2022 was actually kind of shocked me. I thought that there's no way he's signing this law. It's gonna come back and hurt him. Like he's signed an obviously unconstitutional law, harming the doctor-patient relationship, obviously against free speech. But he signed the law, but almost immediately after, you have your case and you have the Ninth Circuit hearing, and the courts are having none of it.
Yeah, so it was not able to be enforced. But as I said, I never really thought, they could never even bring an action under this law and it still would have that effect because it's the threat that they'd do it. So yeah, he signed it. So it takes effect January 1st. We get our injunction a few weeks later. And then, it takes that time to go. The other case goes to appeal. They didn't appeal our case. The state chose not to. And I think that was strategic because they'd rather just have their appeal where they were the winning party in the other case, that it, is a more advantageous position to be in before an appellate court. So it went very badly in July. And then in August, the very last day of the legislative session, all of a sudden, there's an amendment to a bill where they just write in, we're appealing Section 2270 of the Business and Professions Code, which was the section created by AB 2098. So that came in at the very, very end, no discussion. And it was a huge bill that had to pass because or else the medical board would cease to exist. So it was going to pass and they slipped it in, no discussion whatsoever. One senator, I was watching because I wanted to make sure I knew it was passing. It was 10 p.m. on the very last day of the, when the last day you can pass anything. And one senator said, what is this? What is this little provision you just put in there? And the other senator said, I don't know. Do you want to have a big conversation about it? Everybody's there late at night. So it passed and they repealed it. So that's how they slunk off. And in a way, it just felt so disrespectful to everybody's time. They sat there.
Let me just make sure I understand this. So you get these legal victories that essentially freeze the bill. So it's not enforceable in California, even though Governor Newsom signs it. They I don't even know who they is. Some senator. Mm-hmm. Presumably told by Newsom. I don't know why he would do this. If it wasn't that, puts in a provision to this large bill that has to pass that essentially just repeals AB 2098. But they don't make a big deal out of repealing it. They don't tell everybody, "Oh gosh, we made a mistake. We're going to get rid of this thing that we've done." They just quietly, as if no one's going to hear about it, get rid of it. So that maybe they think that people will still think it's still in force or still in place.
Well, that might be true. Yeah, right. It'll still have a chilling effect if people think it's out there. But yeah, it's just so insulting after sitting there and listening to people say, if you don't pass this law, people will die. These, this is this dramatic stuff about why this law is necessary. And I said, well, it's not necessary because anything you need to do, you can already do under existing law. The doctors that are dangerous, you can already go after them. And then they go, oh, yeah, never mind. We didn't need that law anyway. It's with the media reports were, well, we didn't need that anyway. Well, why? why were you there arguing these? I guess silly me, I argue things that I believe in, and so in other words, I was right all along, but nobody's going to say that. But yeah, I mean,
I remember you reporting this, and maybe you give me a call when this happened. But I was just so happy. I mean, it's like this is the way victory happens. Like the people who made the mistake slink off into oblivion.
mhm.
And just like quietly by slinking off, admit that they had done wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess you're never going to get your like, you were right, moment. Although I felt like I got that with the, judge saying I was right, because I was sitting there lecturing people about the law, and everybody's acting like, they're just ignoring me. I mean, it's funny in a way, because in a way I was helping them. I was giving them free legal advice. If they'd actually listened to me, they might have figured out a way to pass a law that wasn't going to get thrown out. But I mean, and now I'm afraid that they will learn from this and come back with another law.
I mean, it may be difficult. I mean, the thing is like there's been at least some attention paid to the bill. I have to say, like, there's been very much less attention paid by the press to the bill and the slinking off and the repeal of it than there really ought to have been in California.
Well, I noticed the press change tone after our hearing. The mainstream press coming out and kind of, before it had been like, all the news articles said, oh, misinformation is killing people and we have to do something about it. We have to censor doctors. And then after our hearing, they're like, well, yeah, okay. The mainstream press wasn't going into this slander. I didn't hear anybody try to say, well, the judge is, corrupt or whatever ad hominem attacks they try to do when they lose.
What it was an enormous free speech victory, and unfortunately much less heralded than it ought to have been. I mean, in the modern age, there's not, unfortunately, too many free speech victories to point to, but this was absolutely one of them.
And we stopped it, and I think the important thing is, I mean, it was openly like a test case, that there was this national call to action to pass laws like this. And so California was like, we're going to be the first. We're going to do this. And so now that it's done, I feel like the other states, we're not going to see laws like this. I mean, I think they're going to have they're trying other tactics. I mean, they're not going to give up on the censorship route.
Okay, so let's just, the last bit, and this is an unfortunate epilogue. There was just an article published in the Atlantic magazine, recapping this era with a very different kind of a discussion than the one we just had the last hour or so. Tell us. I read that piece. I was actually quite dismayed by it. What did you think?
Like I said, I try not to pay too much attention to but it's really kind of surprising to me that it's as if it never happened. Like, we didn't win. They're just talking like. And I think the article says stuff that's not true about the law that they've been saying from the beginning. Oh, it's only going to affect doctors that intentionally, in bad faith, go, harm their patients or something. It's like, that was never what the law was. It would have been a different argument, if you were saying, it would have been a silly law to say, we're just going to go after doctors that intentionally harm their patients. I'm not sure that would, we wouldn't have been in this battle, but it's silly because obviously you can already do that. But yeah, they're still going with this story where they're lying about what the law says.
And it brought back the no license for disinformation people, as if they were like somehow the good guys in this fight, although they were the ones that were trying to suppress the ability of doctors to manage their patients appropriately.
Yeah, I don't understand why they are continuing. They don't seem to recognize that they were wrong. It was in 2022 when these people were lecturing me about constitutional law. I, tried not to, spend a lot of energy thinking about it. But here we are after we won. The federal judge agreed with everything I have been saying, and they still think that something is on their side. I don't understand. I mean, I don't, it's like they learn nothing at all. And then to have this still in the media as if there's a legitimate thing, I can't make sense of it. I can't spend the energy trying to make sense of what's going on.
I think what's going on is that they have lost. They have lost this fight. They've lost the fight over the COVID policy They've lost this fight over free speech rights in the courts, in the courts, and it's just sour grapes. That's what it reads to me like. But they want to maintain the capacity maybe to bring the old gang back together at some point in the future, and the way they do that is by telling people that we have to have the government has to be given the right to suppress people who are spreading misinformation. The irony is that they were the ones who were spreading the most misinformation during the pandemic.
Yeah,
They
I
were
just don't
wrong
know why
about
you
school.
bring back these people. Like they're not the most capable, warriors in this battle. I feel like there's maybe, obviously there's some more sophisticated groups that are involved in censorship and propaganda and, suppression of speech in various ways. But this particular group and this particular fight, they lost. I feel like we really should move on. And there's other issues that we can worry about. I mean, I think they're still going after doctor's speech. They're still trying to find out a way to do it under existing law, and that's unconstitutional. And so that still needs to be fought. But yeah, I don't know how you don't recognize when you lose and maybe find a different tack to take or go back to whatever else they were doing.
Or maybe just support free speech. They could do that.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. I mean, I was looking at some stuff I just can't make sense of. They live in bizarro land where there's a bunch of right-wing authoritarians who are promoting free speech to take over the world, or so. It's so.
Well, it's hard to fathom. I mean, they think of themselves as they're the Davids and we're the Goliaths, when exactly the opposite is true.
Yeah, I don't understand how you get that, where you look at the government and pharmaceutical companies, all the interests on that side, and who you think is on our side. Fine, they want to make up this story about the Koch brothers, but I don't even think the Koch brothers are the Goliath compared to the governments of the world. And
I mean, they're doing the bidding of pharmaceutical industries, even if they don't know it, and some of them know it. Some of them are actually paid by pharmaceutical industries directly. A lot of the advocacy around this was pharmaceutical industry sort of promoted. And you're right there, and it was like massive political actors, the CMA, the California Medical Association, the state medical board groups. I mean, these are all big actors, and they were trying to do something that they absolutely should not have done, and the law actually held up here. I mean, that's actually is the real story here. We were the Davids, you were the David that slew the Goliath, and it was the law that was the slingshot that allowed you to do it.
Yeah. I mean, it is satisfying the way, because it doesn't always work, right? And, defeating the bills, you just don't get them to listen to you if you aren't the CMA, if you aren't the one with the lobbyists that are really putting money in the pockets of politicians. They're not going to listen to you. So defeating the bills without that is very rare. But, this time the courts worked and we won there.
Well, this is why I say you're a hero, Laura. That's why I started the podcast with this. I'm so grateful that you did stand up when no one else was, and just so grateful for for our friendship also, and for the capacity to fight together with you on this.
Yeah, it's definitely the silver lining of the past few years. Like, I mean, when would we ever have crossed paths if it wasn't for this? And so many great people that I've gotten to know through this. That, I mean, really, I feel like, even though it's been unpleasant, I mean, I certainly wouldn't choose to go through the past few years, but everything that I've been doing with myself as a result, I've been very happy with. And I've been very happy with the people I've gotten to know, and, just being like, okay, I'm just going to do things that need to be done. And I'm just going to stand up when somebody needs to stand up, and use, whatever skills I have, I'm going to use them. Not everybody. My skill was like writing letters. I mean, that's how I got on the stage, is I was just writing persuasive, clear letters about this topic. And there were other things I got invited to testify because I sent in the letter and they said, okay, come and be the witness.
Have you must have faced some personal blowback from this. I mean, I know I did.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I was in the whole pandemic kind of disrupted my life so much that I'm just feel like it was like we started over in so many ways. I mean, I was in this very liberal kind of place where people were really brainwashed by all the COVID fear. So, I mean, I kind of felt like I wasn't able to relate to people anyway. You know, it was hard being in the Bay Area here, especially when I was in Oakland. I feel like that was, you know, ground zero for a lot of this stuff. So, you know, it is what it is.
But I did get to meet your family, and I got to meet your kids. They seem to have done very well, despite the pressures in 2020.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Would you do it again if you look back?
Oh, for sure. I mean, this part I've done, for sure. I mean, everything I've been doing, I've been feeling good about. And I feel like, you know, I'm on this path of listening to, you know, when I think something is right, I'm going to do that, and not getting so distracted by what people around me think, or, you know, that's where we've really gone wrong, is listening too much to what the crowd is telling you should be thinking. I mean, I found it great. I mean, besides meeting people like you and, you know, just listening to new ideas, I didn't realize I was in such a bubble, because I was in this kind of, you know, liberal bubble. And so I started listening to different podcasts. I'm like, you know, I can listen to ideas I don't agree with, and it's okay. I didn't realize I wasn't doing that. You know, and you have to do that, right? Isn't this what people used to do in academia? Is you would strengthen your own argument to listen to people you disagree with. You would help you formulate why you believed what you did. So, I mean, on that level, intellectually, the past few years, it's been just, you know, rethinking everything. I mean, it's been so bizarre. I don't know how many people could do what I've done, which is like a 180 flip, basically. I mean, not that I consider myself right wing or anything, but to just really say, wait a minute, I'm going to question everything I believe in and see what I still believe in. You know.
I mean, I think we should all just be thinking human beings. I mean, and I think if we are, sometimes we'll agree with some ideas that we didn't realize were you know, in the mouths of people we thought were bad guys, and sometimes we'll disagree with them. And what we'll end up is not a place where everyone agrees on everything, but a place where reason has a much better chance of succeeding.
Yep, absolutely. And that's why this free speech is so important. You know, you have to listen to all the ideas, let them play out, you know, figure out what is right and wrong. It's never should be set in stone. You keep revising and yeah. So, I mean, yeah, it's all been about free speech for me the past few years. And yeah, I've been enjoying it, even though it is makes life a little more complicated. But yeah, definitely worth it.
Well, thank you, Laura, for being on the show. Thank you for all you've done during the pandemic. So this is Jay Bhattacharya again with the Illusion of Consensus podcast. Until next time.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many. Inflation